Societal change comes about in different ways at different times. It is important to understand how societal change takes place and what the result of such can be. It is likewise important to realize that the methods used to obtain social change has an impact on what the result will be. For instance, in India, Gandhi led social change by leading peaceful marches or rallies. These peaceful rallies were seen throughout the world, and the peace was contrast against the violence used to suppress such. And this brought about the liberation of India. However, within that movement of liberation, there were political maneuverings, and there was violence used to separate from India. And this resulted in a nation being born separate from India that has since dwelt in violence because it was beget of violence. When you look at centuries of occurrence, you see the same basic thing. When a movement starts, it creates an energy, and that energy becomes an autonomous intelligence, and from that there is a life force that moves forward and creates the resultant societal change. For instance, when China had its change from government forms of dynasty to the current forms of government. First, there was a small period of flux where it looked like democracy or a democratic republic would take hold. Then a somewhat pseudo form of democratic communism took hold. But in the process, the people themselves rose up against the government. And when they did, they became a violent mob and overthrew their government, and thus founded the Communist government of China at this moment. The Communist Republic of China was formed by this violence. But what did it create? It created a repressive regime that moved against the educated. It created a repressive regime that ultimately came to fear the people, for the people who had torn down the temples, torn down the government buildings, who had destroyed so much, now had to be contained. And the government itself fears those people even today. And this is why the government is repressive, because it knows that ultimately it was born of a violent birth. And because that is the energy that projected it forth, it is the energy that will slay it or kill it or destroy it in the end. It is simple energies. Now look again at India. India was birthed in a revolutionary way of non-violence, separating from Great Britain. So India itself, with all of its imperfections, is an energetic child moving forth, seeking peace and seeking prosperity, and with all of its fumbling, the energy that pushes it forward is an energy of peace. It will not always be peaceful, but that is the energy projected from the main animus, the main driver, the spirit that was created by Gandhi and his followers. When you look at other governments and how they were birthed, you will see the same types of consequences where the birth builds the energy and creates what is to come in the future. Russia was a violent destruction. And that violent destruction by the people did not destroy, as it did in other places at times, the actual structures. But it was a murderous overthrow. And as a result, it set up a murderous energy where Lenin and Stalin murdered and wantonly killed. But the populace also did, because this was the energy that was created. People were killed for having a little more land, for producing a little better, doing a little better than others, having a little better education. So the country began to feed upon itself until it destroyed much of its own capacities. This was the energy let loose in the revolution. When you look at other countries throughout Asia and throughout the world, you see similar patterns. Now, look at Japan, a conquering country. What happens with Japan? Japan is interestingly rebirthed at its death. For Japan had a chance to reincarnate when it was struck with Hiroshima and Nagasaki being violently destroyed. It was as if the empire itself suffered a fatal blow. But like the phoenix, it arose from the ashes. It had a chance to build anew. And this is different from a country being born through protest or being born through violence or being born through peace. This was a country that was literally fatally wounded and then came back to life as a new being, a new essence from its spiritual heritage. So it was able to rebirth in a very special way that you seldom see in this world. Now, look at the United States of America and think of how it was birthed. It was birthed through the violence of war, claiming the church's policy of just war. The politicians fought to conquer the lands of America, to kill those they considered savages, who often were more spiritual than were their conquerors. And in the process, they took the land by violence. They built the land on slave labor, and once the land was to be self-governing, it overthrew by violence its ties to Europe. So when you look at what America was, how it was birthed out of deceit, how it was birthed by conquering and stealing land, how it was birthed by breaking treaties, and how it was built with slave labor, you come to the conclusion that this all had to build an animus, an energy, a force that would continue. And that force becomes the spirit, the essence of the country. Just as China's overthrow created an energy that became the animus of the country, just as Russia's overthrow of the Tsars became an animus that created the energy and essence of the country, just as Japan was rebirthed and given a new life, and this became the animus and energy of the country, so the violence, the disregard for human life, and the theft in early America created an animus. It generated the energy upon which the country exists, and carried it forward and propelled it. It propelled it through the Civil War. It propelled it even to the times of the 60s and the 50s. It propelled it through Jim Crow and the era after the Civil War. This is an animus to be overcome. And yet you see, when peaceful methods are used, it will create a different energy than when violent methods are used. And in the 50s and in the 60s, there began marches, and there began a desire to make change. And it had to do with racial equality and inequality, and it had to do with an unjust war in Vietnam. But the conflict of energies was such that some people wanted to be peaceful, and others were marching in the streets and burning buildings and rolling buses and cars and throwing Molotov cocktails. So there were two competing energies that formed a genie, an animus of a very mixed nature. And the result of that has been that there has been a confused movement forward that was unable to see itself fulfilled. Now, you have a choice. there is a new chance, a new opportunity to move forward. And the question is, will you seek quick change, moving forward with violence, which ultimately will create an energy that will be a destroying energy and will turn back on you? Or will you seek to work within the bounds of peace? And if you work within the bounds of peace as a people to make change, when your government fails to work within those bounds of peace, the same thing will happen that happened in India. And suddenly, the real changes, the societal changes will come. And like India, they will last, and you can move forward and build upon them just as they are building upon them. However, if you break away with violence, just as occurred with the nations attached to India, then what will happen? Those who break away with violence will become subject to violence, and it will become a long-term problem, just as it has in other countries throughout the world. Now, you notice we've not named these countries, because the moment you do, someone will be crying, "Oh, how could you say such a thing?" But we encourage you just to take a little look at how countries are birthed, how governments are birthed, and what the result ultimately is, how they have to govern. Now, think of France for a moment. France had a king that had ignored the economic consequences relevant to the people and the change of the social times. And when we say a king, we should say that this was not created by the ruling king, but had been created by situational circumstance through several generations. And as a result, the government was out of sync with the people. And the people overthrew the government. But with overthrowing the government, even though they created a republic, they became less than they would be had they done so peacefully. Now, you live in a time of change. You live in an era of change. You live in a new epoch. There is the beginning of great change. This is the new astrological age. This is an era of communication and electricity. This is an era of magnetism. This is an era where there shall be great change. But how that change takes place depends on each of you as individuals. Each individual is important. First, find the divine within, find the kingdom within, find peace within, and let that peace emanate without. For we tell you this: that which is birthed in peace lives in peace. That which is birthed in violence lives in violence. That which would be a child of love, must emanate love, must be born of love. It has been said, to inherit the kingdom, you must be born again. We tell you, you must be born of love. We leave you with blessings and with peace. Peace be with each of you.